Hey guys, welcome back to more Entitled People stories. In this video, a crazy lawyer robs and blackmails my family for over $380,000. Let's dive right into the video. And the first story starts like this. Growing up in Dallas, I always dreamed of becoming a lawyer. My parents, hardworking immigrants from Mexico, instilled in me a deep sense of justice and a fierce determination to succeed. They poured everything they had into giving me opportunities they never had, my mom juggling multiple jobs to save for my college fund and my dad working punishing hours in construction to keep a roof over our heads. Their unwavering belief in me led me to Baylor Law and ultimately to a position at a small personal injury firm in San Antonio. I threw myself into work driven by a passion for defending the rights of the marginalized and exploited. Our clients were primarily working-class Latinos, many of them undocumented, toiling in dangerous jobs with little recourse when injured. All over Texas, predatory employers, insurers, and lawyers prey on these vulnerable communities, knowing language barriers and fear of deportation keeps many from fighting back. I quickly earned a reputation as a tenacious advocate willing to go toe-to-toe with powerful interests on behalf of the powerless. Late nights poring over medical records and liability waivers, standing up to corporate lawyers in court and at the negotiating table, this was my calling. Still, the long hours and distance from Dallas meant fewer visits home to see my aging parents. Our phone calls were filled with catching up on family gossip and my latest courtroom triumphs, but looking back, I missed the warning signs of trouble. The first inkling came when my dad suffered a devastating leg injury at his construction site. A badly set scaffold collapsed, sending him plummeting 2 stories. He narrowly avoided being paralyzed, but the compound fractures to his tibia and ankle were a career-ending catastrophe. I offered to take on his workers' comp case immediately, knowing that he would need every penny to cover his surgeries and long rehab ahead. But my proud, stubborn father refused, insisting he already had a lawyer and didn't want to impose. No matter how much I pushed, he wouldn't budge, placating me with vague assurances that my uncle would help navigate the language barrier. Buried in my own caseload, I let it drop. I didn't learn until much later that my uncle had never been involved at all. Weeks passed and I was shocked to get the news that Dad's case had been settled for a whopping $380,000. The seriousness of his injuries, the permanent mobility issues he'd face, the pain management and physical therapy he would require for life, it added up to a strong claim. But for an undocumented construction worker, it was a nearly unprecedented payout. I was so relieved I wept at my desk, the weight of worry I'd been carrying evaporating in an instant. I immediately took time off and drove up to Dallas to celebrate with my family, a whirlwind weekend of laughter, tears, and mom's homemade tamales. My dad did not want to dwell on the details of the case, so I didn't press, giddy with joy and more than a little tequila. I found it strange that this lawyer was notably absent from the festivities, not even popping in for a congratulatory handshake, but chalked it up to a busy schedule. That blissful ignorance shattered a few months later when my uncle appeared unannounced on my doorstep, grim-faced and clutching an overstuffed manila folder. "Mio, we need to talk," he said, voice heavy with worry. "Your papa, he's in trouble." Stunned, I invited him in, mind-reading as he recounted a twisted tale of greed manipulation and brazen fraud dating back months. Basically, the lawyer my dad hired was not the benevolent advocate he had claimed. He was a shark well known in legal circles for aggressive ambulance chasing and a roster of exclusively Latino clients despite not speaking a word of Spanish. More concerning, my dad apparently had not seen a penny of his settlement. The money had supposedly been paid out, but he and mom were working themselves to the bone, my mom juggling part-time gigs while my dad took whatever odd construction jobs he could land under the table. His leg was not healing properly, the constant strain setting back his recovery. But they were drowning in unpaid medical bills. Even worse, the lawyer had them convinced this was the only way, that if they stopped paying him, he would report them to ICE and they would be deported. He dangled the promise of the settlement over their heads, claiming the funds were tied up in red tape at the insurance company, but if they just kept quiet and kept paying, it would all work out. A little digging revealed the extent of the lawyer's crimes. He had used a network of shell companies to divert settlement funds, paying out only a trickle to keep clients complacent. The threat of deportation was his trump card, wielded again and again to silence any complaints. On paper, his clients received their full payouts, but in reality, they remained indebted to him indefinitely, bound by fear. I was both horrified and consumed with guilt. How could I have missed this? How could I have left my parents so vulnerable? I knew I had to make it right, but I also knew I could not be reckless. As much as I wanted to storm into the lawyer's office and confront him, I knew it would only backfire. He was too slippery, too well insulated by a web of lies and accomplices. If I tipped him off, he would bury the evidence and likely retaliate against my family. Instead, I went to my firm and laid out the whole sordid story. To their immense credit, they immediately threw their full support behind me. We quietly hired a crackerjack team of private investigators and started building an ironclad case. For months, we surveilled the lawyer, documenting his every move. Cash withdrawals from client trust accounts, clandestine meetings with known associates, even verbal threats made to a sobbing client in a shadowy parking lot. We caught it all on camera. The evidence was damning, but we needed even more. We needed a paper trail proving the depths of his financial misdeeds. I embedded myself in the Latino community, earning trust and gathering testimony from his past victims. Horror stories of lost homes, of medical needs going unmet, of years spent in indentured servitude to a sociopath with a law degree. Bit by excruciating bit, the puzzle pieces fell into place. Shell companies, forged signatures, cooked books, a far-reaching conspiracy to defraud the most vulnerable for personal gain. When we finally took our case to the DA, it was a slam dunk. The lawyer and his cronies were arrested in a dramatic sting operation that made the front page of every paper in the state. Charges of grand larceny, fraud, extortion, and a host of other crimes carrying the promise of decades behind bars. In the end, the lawyer opted to plead guilty, hoping for leniency. At his sentencing, the judge was disgusted by him for the betrayal of the very people he had sworn an oath to defend. He got several years in prison and a lifetime disbarment, a fitting end for a career built on lies. For my family, it was a bittersweet victory. They got their money back, every penny, but the scars ran deep. Dad's leg had healed improperly in the intervening months and would never be the same. The years of crippling stress and financial instability had taken their toll. I moved them down to San Antonio, where I could ensure they got the best possible care. Also physical therapy, counseling, and specialists for every need. I was determined to give them back the peaceful retirement they deserved. It was an adjustment for all of us, but we navigated it together. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I'm just happy this awful, entitled, crazy lawyer got what he deserved, and I hope he won't see the light of day again anytime soon, aka get out of prison. Either way, the next one is another lawyer revenge story. It starts like this. How's it going? It was Kurt. I did not like talking to Kurt, but I couldn't help it. We'd been classmates in law school. Kurt had finished near the bottom and I near the top, but Kurt was doing great and I was really struggling. I told Kurt that I was doing okay. What do you got today? He asked. I had a bail hearing. I was starting to do more contested bail hearings because bail court was always packed and it was a great place to pick up clients. You show up, fight for your client, and if you're lucky, you pick up another client, and on a good day, maybe even two. Just a bail hearing, I said. What about you? I have 5 guilty pleas, said Kurt, not trying to keep the delight out of his voice. Wow, that's great, Kurt. Kurt was a dump truck. Back in the 90s, that's what we called lawyers like Kurt, lawyers who knew no plea other than guilty. Kurt was gonna plead 5 people guilty that day, and the legal aid plan was gonna reward him handsomely for throwing his clients under the bus. He'd be leaving the courthouse a G-note richer in receivables, and he said, I've opened 20 files this month. Things are going really great, how about you? I'm doing okay, I said, and excused myself to do my crappy little bail hearing. I entered the courtroom and sat up front waiting for things to get started, and while I waited I wondered why Kurt had so many clients and I had so few. Kurt went to law school as a mature student, in his mid-30s when we started, but around 40 now. Maybe his maturity helped him. He had a hint of grey at the temples, but I had no grey at all. Instead, I had a decidedly baby-faced look about me. Maybe that was it, I thought to myself. Maybe I should grow a beard or something, make myself look a bit older. Then court started and I sat around waiting for my client's case to be called. We did not have smartphones back in those days, so I sat there and watched as the judge started to run through his docket. There were a few consents and adjournments or two, a comically brief contested bail hearing that ended with a self-rep being sent back to the cells in a rage, and then it was my client's turn. I don't know, this is contested, the prosecutor said. We are willing to grant bail on conditions. I explained that my client didn't want conditions other than to keep the peace and be of good behavior. The judge sighed and told the prosecutor to get on with it, so the prosecutor put the complainant on the stand, my client's ex-wife, and the court heard her tale of how my client had beaten her and tossed her down the porch steps at his house. When she finished, I got up to cross-examine. My client had told me a very different story about how his ex-wife went down the stairs and some more things besides. I believe you have a conviction for prostitution. That's how I began. I've always liked getting straight to the point, and yeah, but I got a pardon, so it doesn't count, the so-called victim said. That was a pretty good start, and it got better when the woman admitted, after a bit of rough handling to her chronic alcoholism, that she was excluded from all family events, that she knew she was unwelcome at her ex-husband's home, and the final kicker, that after leaving said ex-husband's house she had been arrested for drunk driving, and it was only at the station after she blew 145 that the cops noticed bruising, and she told him all about what her evil ex-husband had done to her when she had shown up for a family gathering. After I was done with her, I put my client's current wife on the stand, an eyewitness to everything including the so-called victim's drunken fall, and when she finished her testimony the prosecutor leaned over to me and said that he'd be dropping the charges. A pretty good result for junior lawyer me, but not really, because my client was factually innocent and the prosecutor's witness was about as bad as you get, but still, I was feeling proud of myself. "Eat that, Kurt," I thought as I headed for the door. "Eat that, you dump truck." I left the courtroom and headed for the lawyer's lounge to brag of my success. I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and saw an old guy. "I need a lawyer," he said. He was maybe 50, which to me was pretty old. I recognized the man. He'd been in court for a change of bail conditions on consent. He'd been hanging around waiting for paperwork when the court recessed. "I remember you. You're the guy charged with destroying a house." I didn't totally destroy it. That was true, in the sense that the house was still standing, but he had taken a chainsaw to it and other tools as well, and by the time the bank got him out of there, the place was a wreck. The man had not taken too kindly to being tossed out for not making the mortgage payments. I asked if he had any paperwork on him. He pulled out the original bail conditions, one of which was to keep his paperwork on him at all times. I glanced at it, charged with damaging a mortgagee's interest in a property. Interesting, heard of that one but never seen it. "It's not fair," he said. "I don't want to go to jail again." I asked him what was his prior conviction. "That's just it. I already went to jail for this house thing. 15 days I got. The judge gave me 15 days last month." "What?" The man said more words and then more, but his words were scattered nonsense you hear from clients sometimes, the narrative out of order, the important facts buried under irrelevant nonsense, and in the end it took me almost 30 minutes to get the full story out of him at the coffee shop around the corner. But by the time he finished, I was excited. I was more than excited. I was seriously stoked. "So let me get this straight," I said. "The bank noticed you were wrecking the house with power tools when they came to check things out." "Right." He was about to start talking again, but I held up my hand. "And when they saw what you were doing, they got a court order telling you to stop wrecking the house." "Right, and..." I held up my hand again. "And after you got that court order, you wrecked the house even more, as in a lot more." I was pretty mad. "Wouldn't you be if you were being kicked out of your own home?" And when the bank saw that you had breached a court order, they brought a motion for contempt. "Yeah, and the judge, he gave me 15 days and I served the whole 15, no parole or nothing." That seemed harsh, but when I looked into things a bit later, I learned that it was true and that some prison officials thought that the usual parole rules didn't apply to those convicted of contempt. "That's pretty harsh," I said. "So do you think you can do something for me?" We made an appointment for him to come to my office later that week, and after our appointment and receiving his retainer check, I started to dance around like a nut. I burst into Aaron's office. "You will never believe this," I said. "I got news." "Yeah?" said Aaron, the lawyer I rented space from. He was in his mid-40s, technically married but on his way to a divorce and locked in perpetual mortal combat with his ex. "Do I get a piece?" he said. Aaron's family law lawyer was super expensive. I shook my head. Nope, I landed this client on my own and you'll never guess how I'm gonna plead him. Guilty? Of course not. I hated pleading clients guilty. It was a last resort sort of thing. I was at court to keep people out of jail, not help put them in. So not guilty. Nope, I said. So you got your first insanity plea. Congratulations. Aaron found me amusing and maybe a little weird. I'd been lawyering for almost 3 years by this point, but I'd lost none of the glee that I'd started out with. I still haven't, after more than 30 years. Nope, you'll never guess. Guess what? Said Dimitri, walking in to join us. He had been promoted to Aaron's partner, and, well, a big mistake on Aaron's part. That promotion is what started them both on the path to disbarment. I got this new case and I'm gonna plead the guy autrefois convict. They stared at me blankly. I decided to educate them. Aside from the usual guilty or not guilty, there's two other pleas: autrefois acquit and autrefois convict. You plead a guy autrefois convict if he's already been convicted of the thing he's charged with. When I'd learned about autrefois pleas in law school, I thought I'd never get a chance to do one. I'd never heard of anyone pleading it. It was just one of the zillion things I learned in law school that got shoved to the back of my brain as an interesting thing, but something that I'd never need. After all, how often do people get charged twice for the same thing? That's it, said Aaron. That's why you're excited? Because you're pleading this autrefois thing? Aaron didn't get it, neither did Dimitri. When I got home that night, I told my wife all about it and she didn't really get it either, not being a lawyer, but she understood me and was happy for me, plus the $1,000 retainer. That made us both happy. The following month my client's case came up and I was ready. I was stoked. I checked the list and saw that I'd drawn Judge Herman, also known as the Hermanator, but I didn't mind. The Hermanator was a real hard ass, but he respected good legal arguments and I had a good one that day. I walked into the lawyer's lounge and grabbed a cup of the crappy coffee that was always on tap. In less than an hour, I was gonna be in a courtroom. I was gonna plead my client autrefois convict, and when I said those words, jaws would drop, pens would stop writing, mouths would stop moving, and all heads would turn at the strange plea, so rarely heard in a courtroom, and everyone would look at the lawyer who had entered the unusual plea, and they would say, "Who is this young lawyer, this new Robinette, this Greenspan, this Cicero, this, hey, what do you have today?" It was Kurt the dump truck, Kurt of the quick and dirty guilty pleas. Prosecutors loved Kurt, judges loved Kurt. But defense lawyers hated him and he was barely tolerated in the lawyer's lounge. "A plea," I said, feeling smug. "Just one? I've got 6. That's a record for me. I only had 5 coming, but I picked up another." "That's great, Kurt, just great." Kurt's crap could not touch me today. I was pleading a guy autrefois convict and I didn't give a damn how well Kurt was doing or how badly my practice was struggling. I was in legal heaven. But I did not enjoy Kurt's company, so I left him and the crappy coffee in the lawyer's lounge and went out into the hallways to find my client. I found him sitting on a bench outside the courtroom. We had a brief discussion. "What do you mean you switched lawyers?" I said. "I talked to this guy," he said. "What guy?" He handed me a card, but before I looked at it, I knew what I would see. "Kurt Mandrick," the card said. "Barrister, solicitor, and dump truck." "But why?" I asked. "Why would you want to switch lawyers on the day of your court case?" "I know this case inside out. I'm totally prepared. We're gonna plead you Yeah, about that whatever thing. Mr. Mandrick says he's never heard of it, but it's not really a plea. It's just gonna make the judge mad." Dump truck Kurt had never heard of the plea of autrefois convict, and he had infected the client with his ignorance. I tried to explain the autrefois convict plea again, but the client was locked in, and it's hard to shake a client who is locked in on some idiot's notion. "Yeah, so Mr. Mandrick says he gets along great with the judges and stuff, and he told me I'd walk out of here with no jail time for sure." Wait here. I abandoned my client on the bench and headed back to the lawyer's lounge to have a short word with Kurt. When I opened the door to the lounge, there were a few of the older lawyers, the usual crowd. A couple of them were yakking away, another was making notes. Over in the corner was Kurt. I didn't want to embarrass Kurt or anything like that, and besides that, even at that young age, I'd already developed a wonderful sense of tact, of how to handle difficult situations, politely and calmly. "What the F, Kurt?" I shouted. Pens stopped writing and mouths stopped moving, and heads turned towards me. Kurt looked up at me appalled. "What the F?" I said again. "You stole my client, the guy who wrecked his house." The older lawyers looked over in disapproval. I turned to them and pointed at Kurt. "He stole my client right out in the hallway. I'm on the record, I got a retainer and all that, and this guy, this dump truck stole my client and now he's gonna plead him guilty." "He wants to plead guilty," Kurt said, "only because he's an idiot." I left the lawyer's lounge and headed back to where my client was waiting. I could hear the dump truck following me, and then Kurt and I fought it out in front of the client. An unseemly squabble, embarrassing really, especially considering that I lost. I lost to Kurt of the guilty plea, Kurt the dump truck. I was forced to admit defeat. "Fine," I said, "but I'm gonna watch. I'm gonna get my money's worth." "What do you mean?" the client said. "I'm keeping your retainer. You're not getting a penny back." Our squabble became louder and more unseemly, and it ended only when the doors opened and it was time to enter the courtroom and watch the Hermanator dispense justice. I sat there for an hour listening to adjournments and pleas, and when it was the turn of my former client and his new lawyer Kurt, it was time for Kurt to work his magic. I watched as Kurt pleaded this man guilty without negotiating with the prosecutor, without preparation, without anything at all. "My client's a first offender," Kurt said, going on about his client's spotless reputation, about the client's moment of madness, his speedy regret, assurances that he would never do anything like that again. But this was Judge Herman's courtroom, and Herman liked to draw blood. He gave the client 30 days and the client jumped to his feet. "But the last time the judge only gave me 15, it's not fair." "15 days for what?" said the judge. "15 days for wrecking a house." The judge turned to the prosecutor. "I thought you said no priors." The prosecutor shook his head. "Nothing that I can see." "Well," said the judge, "he is admitted to a prior, and I'm entitled to believe an admission against interest." He turned back to the poor sap standing in the dock before him. "I was gonna give you 30, but seeing as you have a prior, and for the same thing," all Kurt could manage was a feeble but. Then he turned and looked at me as if for rescue. He mouthed something to me, and to this day I think he mouthed something like, "What was that plea?" But I ignored him, and I watched as the Hermanator gave the client 60 days. The client began to speak, but it was the same style as he had displayed in the coffee shop, a spew of meaningless words. The judge told him to shut up and sit down. When I walked out, Kurt was trying to get the judge to let his client serve his time on weekends, but the Hermanator was not known for letting people serve time on weekends, and I didn't need to hear the rest. I went back to the lawyer's lounge and told everyone the gory details. We all had a good laugh at Kurt's expense, and when I got home that night, my wife asked how did the case go, the case with that special plea. "It went great, really great," I said and handed her a check for $1,000. And it was great actually, because that day the older lawyers in the lounge treated me like a peer, I felt their respect, and that made it all worthwhile. And wow, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, this story was absolutely amazing, and to be honest, I would love to read more stories like this. But unfortunately, it seems like there are not many lawyers out there that write stories like this. I would have never thought that a courtroom or a lawyer could write stories like this. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripe Stories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again tomorrow.